Have you ever had one of those experiences where you just knew there's no way anyone's ever going to believe this? Like, unless I get some sort of proof, some sort of picture as evidence, nobody's going to believe this actually happened to me. A few years ago, I was flying to Nashville, and I took one of those small planes, the red-eye flights, so it was a little cheaper. And I remember joking with my wife, could you imagine if P.K. Subban, for some reason, was flying to Nashville the same time as me? You see, at that time, he was still a defenseman for the Predators, the hockey team there. And I was thinking, there's no way a famous guy like P.K. Subban would be on a flight with common people like me. Well, sure enough, we get to the airport, and I'm waiting to board the flight, and this P.K. Subban-looking guy with that beauty country-looking fedora walks in, and I'm thinking, no way. This cannot be P.K. You're just tricking yourself, Andrew. But sure enough, he starts signing people's jerseys, and I'm thinking, no, it's really P.K. Andrew, you have to get a pic, or nobody's going to believe you. We get on the flight. He's sitting just a few seats over from me, close enough that I can hear within earshot what him and his seat buddy are talking about, but not so close that he can see me just kind of creepily trying to take an over-the-shoulder picture. And the whole time I'm listening to their conversation, the guy he sat with knows nothing about hockey. Is there any justice? He says, what do you do for a living? And PK's just kind of like, well, I'm a hockey player. Oh yeah, what position do you play? And I'm thinking, no, is there any justice? This can't be happening. The whole time I'm trying to get a picture of PK. We get off the flight. I even follow him around like a stalker, but I never get a picture. As far as anyone else is concerned, I just made the whole story up. I might as well say I'm best friends with Jimmy Fallon. I write all his jokes for him. No. I walked on the moon. No picture, no proof. Some experiences in life, you just have to see it to believe it. Am I right? For some of you listening this morning, that's the way you feel about the Bible, about God or religion, Jesus, the resurrection. You say the Easter story, yeah, that's just a nice story that Christians tell themselves. They made up so that they'll feel better and have some sort of hope in the hard times. Or maybe for you, you used to believe the Easter story, but then somewhere along the way, you started to have doubts, and you have your hang-ups, and you decided, no, this just can't be real. Would you believe me if I told you the first disciples of Jesus, the men and women who spent 3.5 years with him, doubted the resurrection at first? If you don't believe me, I'd encourage you, open a Bible to John chapter 20, because I want to take you to the first Easter story. If you don't own a Bible, just open your phone, flip open the Bible app on your phone. You'll be right there with us. I want to show you, I'm not making this up. And as you turn there, what I'll tell you is there's 4 people who wrote down the story of Jesus' life. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're called Gospels, the good news about Jesus. And there's 4 accounts of how this story took place. Luke, what he tells us is that there was a few women who first discovered that the tomb was empty, that Jesus had been risen from the dead. And so they come back and tell the disciples. And here's what Luke tells us. But they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Matthew, he's another guy who records the story for us. At the very end of his book, Matthew chapter 28, he gives us the Great Commission. It's sort of like Jesus' last instructions, the whole mission, the game plan for his followers. But before we get the Great Commission, we get the Great Hesitation. Jesus' followers had spent these 3.5 years with him. They had heard the best teaching they would ever hear. They'd seen him heal people. They'd heard him tell them once, no, twice, thrice, I'm going to have to suffer. I'm going to have to die, but 3 days later, I will rise again. And yet, look what Matthew says right before what Christians call the Great Commission. Verse 16 of Matthew chapter 28. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. And when they saw him, they worshipped him. But some doubted. Can you picture it? They're standing right in front of Jesus after he had died. He's now alive, and some doubted. If that's not the greatest news in the world for the skeptic, for those who have doubts, for those who have questions about their faith, I don't know what it is. If you're the person who's got to see it to believe it, you're not alone. Jesus' first followers had their doubts about the resurrection. But if you were raised in the church, except for you always felt like it was someone else's faith and someone else was telling you what to believe, this is your moment. I want to challenge you to take the next few moments to truly consider the Easter story and whether you believe it for yourself. But some of us listening this morning, we believe this story. We're Jesus followers. But we still have our doubts. And sometimes we worry, does that make me a bad Jesus follower? And what I want to encourage you is that Jesus isn't mad at you because Jesus' own disciples, the first disciples, had their doubts. But he does want to deal with your doubt. So what convinced the disciples that Jesus really rose? What brought them from doubt to devout? What caused the Christian faith to spread like wildfire to the point that over 2 billion people today would say they're believers of Jesus? Well, let's jump into the story, John chapter 20, and read it for ourselves. Verse 1 says, early on the first day of the week, that would be Sunday, Easter Sunday, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. It's probably that time in the night where you don't really want to be going to a gravesite, and yet Mary just has to go and check in. Maybe she was even going to try and make sure everything was okay, might have even wanted to go and anoint Jesus' body. Different people differ on what she was doing there. But so she went to the tomb, she saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance, and so she came running to Simon Peter, one of Jesus' main guys, and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. By the way, that's John, the guy who wrote the gospel. That's his way of referring to himself. He's so humbled, he's so blown away that Jesus would love him. He can't even use his own name. He just says, I'm the one Jesus loved. Can you imagine that? And she doesn't believe it. Mary doesn't believe that Jesus had risen at this point. She says, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb. We don't know where they've put him. She thought the body was stolen. So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. You gotta love, John has a chance to record the Easter story for history, and he just has to add a little note. By the way, I beat Peter to the tomb. You dog, John, you dog. Both were running, and the other disciple outran Peter. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He's always impulsive. He's always just doing things. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was lying in its place, separate from the linen. And finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first. Did I mention I beat Peter to the tomb? Finally, John goes inside. He saw and believed. That's a different word for saw there John's using. Now he's saying, I understand, and now I comprehend it. He saw and he believed because they did not understand from the scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. What is it that caused Jesus' first disciples to believe, that convinced them that he really rose from the dead? In short, it's what they saw. Sometimes seeing is believing. Jesus' first followers, at least most of them, the things they saw caused them to believe. For John, here in verse 8, he reaches the tomb, he looks inside, he sees, and he believes. The guys go back to tell the other disciples what they've seen. And at this time, Mary kind of makes her way, or maybe she was tagging along and the guys just outran her. But she goes to the tomb and she has this interaction with 2 angels. And all of a sudden she turns around and there's Jesus. Mary is the first person to see Jesus. What an opportunity. She goes back to tell everyone, I've seen the Lord. Verse 18. Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, I have seen the Lord. And she told them that he had said these things to her. They had a little conversation where she understood it was Jesus. And in verse 19, on the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Talk about a terrifying experience. He has to calm them down. Peace. After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side, and the disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Mary and the first disciples, they saw the real risen Jesus, and they believed. But not all of Jesus' first disciples saw him and believed. There was one disciple in particular who didn't see him. His name is Thomas. You may have heard his story before as Thomas the Doubter. Verse 24. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, he's the twin, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. And so the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my fingers where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Poor Thomas. He doubts one thing and he goes down in history as the doubter. He's decided, he's had such a traumatic week, the worst week of his life. He says, I'm not just going to go along with the crowd anymore. I'm not just going to believe what everyone else sees. I'm done. Unless I see some evidence, I'm not going to believe it. And some of us are there this morning. We say, God, unless you show me you're really real, I'm just not going to believe. You need to prove to me that you exist. But others of us, we doubt in different ways. Maybe it's not the resurrection you doubt, but you have other aspects of the Christian faith that you doubt. Can I be honest with you for a second? One of the beautiful things about talking to a camera is you don't get a choice. I'm going to be honest with you. For the longest time, the doubt that I had, the struggle that I had, even into my college years, was how could a God, a just God, a perfect God, a mighty God, a holy God, how could he love someone like me? I doubted that I could be good enough for God. And I struggled with this for many years. I don't think I'm just over that struggle. But for Thomas, his doubt, his whole hang-up was this business of resurrection. And so Jesus even helps him out with that. Go to verse 26. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said again, "Peace be with you." And then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." The disciples saw the risen Jesus and they believed. Thomas saw the risen Jesus. And here's what he says: "My Lord and my God, my Master and my Creator, my Maker." Thomas immediately believed when he saw the risen Jesus. But some of you would say, Andrew, that's a fun story, and I understand that for you that's real, for your church maybe even that's real, but I'm just not there. I can't bring myself to believe in some God I can't see, and especially this business of resurrection and Jesus. I'm just not there. I can't believe it. And I tell you, that's okay. You're allowed to have your doubts. And I hope that I'd be able to have another conversation with you again. I hope that maybe even you'll join us again on a Sunday morning. Same time, same place, at least for now, because God can handle your doubts. Maybe one day we'll even be able to get a coffee and we can talk through some of the logical reasons why the resurrection, Jesus being raised from the dead, makes sense. For instance, there are medical examiners that would say there's no way someone could go through the process of Roman crucifixion and not actually fully die. Because some people think Jesus just didn't really die. He was still kind of alive when they put him in the tomb. But there is a lot of medical experts that would say, no way, that's impossible. Or the fact of the empty tomb. Very few people would argue that the tomb actually was empty. And so what are the reasons? Was it stolen? Well, it couldn't have been Jesus' disciples. One of them is recorded as staying for his death. How did they all of a sudden build up the courage to come steal his body? And why would his opponents steal his body and actually help this myth of resurrection? Jesus rising from the dead is the best explanation of the empty tomb. And then lastly, if you're going to tell a story and you want people to believe it's true, you wouldn't in the first century start your story with the first witnesses being women. Women weren't allowed to be witnesses in a story. And so if you want people to believe it's true, why would you start with those facts? But the truth is, I can tell you these things and we can talk about these things, but you're smart people. You probably have your defenses and your reasons you don't believe. If not, you can just Google reasons why what I'm saying you don't need to believe. The truth is, I'm not going to be able to convince you on my own. You know, the only thing that's actually going to be able to convince you that this story, that this Easter story is real, is you've got to be open to the idea that it might just be true. And God himself needs to convince you. The only one who's going to convince you that this story is true is God himself. I believe with everything I have that God can handle your doubts, and he wants to have a relationship with you. You know how I know that? Because at the end of this story that we're reading, Jesus actually has a message for you. If you don't believe me, check it out yourself. Go back to John chapter 20, and now in verse 28, this has all happened. Stop doubting and believe. Verse 28, Thomas said, "My Lord and my God." And then Jesus says this, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen me and yet believed." It might be true that seeing is believing, but Jesus said, "Blessed are those who don't see and still believe." Jesus challenges you. Jesus invites you to believe it, even though you don't see it. And so if you have your doubts, that's okay, because there is a sense in which the Christian faith is a leap of faith. But so is denying God. So is saying that you're in control of your own life and you get to make your own autonomous decisions. That also takes faith, because none of us can prove to each other without a doubt that our theory and that our view of what's going to happen after this life is true. And by the way, is it possible that your theories, that the different defenses that you've made up are a guard? Because you know that if this story is true, it's going to demand your life. But Christians don't just believe this story as a leap of faith. It's not just a leap of faith. The reason we believe it is because there were people who saw it. There were real witnesses and people with the testimony that this is what they saw, and so they believed it. But it wasn't just their evidence. It was also their experience. After Christ left earth, the whole book of Acts is what happened as the church just exploded. And most of these guys, these first disciples, died for their faith. They were so convinced that it was real. God had done something inside of them. They had this experience that they committed their lives to it. Even if they wanted to deny it, they couldn't. Seldom will somebody die for something that they know is a lie. They believed it with everything they had because they saw Jesus risen from the dead. They all write their own story. They want to prove that it's true. And so John himself, here's how he ends off this chapter. He tells the story. He just witnesses about it. John 20, verse 30. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. This is the story of the cross. This is the story of the resurrection. We can have life in his name. For me, though, the doubt, what I talked about earlier, how could God love me? That doubt didn't just disappear overnight. Like it almost seemed to for Thomas. It wasn't this light bulb moment. I wrestled with that for years and years, and thanks to the help of great pastors and mentors and Christian friends, eventually I realized God's value of me, God being able to save me, God's love for me actually had nothing to do with my ability to keep him happy. It actually had almost nothing to do with me. And one of the passages that spoke to me most, I hope it speaks to you, is Ephesians chapter 2. It's all about God's grace. I won't read the whole thing for you, but what it says in verse 3 is, all of us used to live in that way, following the passionate desires and the inclinations of our sinful nature. But by our very nature, we were subject to God's anger, just like everyone else. But God is so rich in mercy, and he loved us so much that even though we were dead because of our sins, he gave us life when he raised Christ from the dead. God saved you by his grace when you believed. And you can't take credit for it. It's a gift from God. Salvation is not a reward for the good things that we've done, so none of us can boast about it. As this text kind of just spoke to my life, I realized what God had done for me. And I still had doubts. I still had things that I questioned, but God and his love for me, and the fact that his grace is so much more than my struggles and my sins, it just took over. And suddenly my relationship with Christ was so much more important than all of my doubts. And it's possible, as you've been listening to John's eyewitness account of the resurrection, the Easter story, something has jarred in you this morning. And I just want to encourage you to deal with that. Don't just leave that and then forget about it. Make Easter 2020 memorable for more than just being stuck at home this year and not able to celebrate with family. Make today the day you really believe that Jesus died and rose again. Stop right now and you can pray to him. Say, Jesus, I believe it. I believe you died to pay the price for my sin, but I also believe you rose again. And because you rose again, I know after this life, after I pass away, I will rise again and I will live with you forever. But for some of us, today's talk, John's message, has piqued our curiosity, but we're just not sure we're ready to make some kind of commitment yet. I'd encourage you, keep wrestling with those questions. And if there's a chance that I could even answer questions for you, if we could talk about it, please do reach out to me, andrew@calvarygospel.ca. I would love an opportunity to talk to you more about this story because it changes everything. Happy Easter. From my family to yours.